An introduction to English figurative language. Figurative language, in case you didn't know, is the opposite of literal language. Figuratively is the opposite of literally, and figures of speech are basically words or phrases used figuratively, not to be taken literally. Literary tropes are basically figurative language used for artistic or rhetorical effect. Might talk about literary and rhetorical devices. Figurative language is basically something that really spices up the language, and if you're a writer, it makes sense to use it in your writing. An idiom is a standard expression that is meant figuratively, a standard expression in a language. Other languages have their own idioms, and English has its. So let's go through some of the literary tropes here. Just some terms so that you know what they mean, and so that you might also be able to use these consciously. Analogy, that's another word for comparison. Metaphor is something claimed as identical to the figurative comparison, while simile is a comparison like a metaphor, but with a connector. For instance, the words like or as, so it's not claimed as identical. For instance, a metaphor is like saying that the backpack you're carrying weighs a ton, that's a metaphor. Saying it feels like it weighs a ton or something like that. That sounds more like a simile, not a metaphor. An allegory, now that's a symbolic story meant as a metaphor, and my best example is the novel Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is an allegory for the Russian Revolution. So it's basically the Russian Revolution retold, but with animals instead. So it's an allegory. A parable, which is a kind of allegory, usually shorter, is something that is meant to teach some kind of moral lesson. Very famous, of course, is Jesus in the New Testament, famous for his parables. And metonymy, that's a use of a word associated with a thing for the whole thing. For instance, to say the White House when you're not just referring to the building, but you're referring to the government, to the president and his administration or something like that. While synecdoche is a form of metonymy, very closely related. That's using a part of a whole to refer to the whole, or vice versa. For instance, using lead, which is something that bullets is made of, to refer to bullets figuratively. And some other here, irony is suggesting the opposite of what something really means. This is very basic, of course. Innuendo has to do with hidden meaning, insinuations, suggesting something derogatory often, something rude, can't be said out loud. Ambiguity, that means a phrase can have two meanings, it's ambiguous. A pun is a word play, using a word with two meanings or two similar sounding words. Okay, a pun is a word play on words. Hyperbole, that's another word for exaggeration, for figurative exaggeration. And parody, of course, is humoristic imitation. And if you combine these, you could get satire. Now, that means basically a humoristic critique of something using things like irony and exaggeration, hyperbole, and parody. And Jon Stewart, former host of the sort of fake news show called The Daily Show, is very famous for his satire. A proverb, sometimes also called an adage, or in more simple terms, a saying, is something that is supposed to convey common sense wisdom. You know, these are proverbs, like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, the grass is greener on the other side. These are proverbs supposed to convey some common sense wisdom. It can be very old. While an aphorism, something that looks a lot like a proverb, more a laconic statement of opinion. Laconic means just very short and to the point. Statement of opinion, like a saying, usually a quote from an author, like, for instance, Oscar Wilde, who said, "Nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing." That sounds like a saying, but he said it, and it's like a statement of opinion. It's called an aphorism. A neologism, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is a new word, newly coined, a word or expression. A few examples here. The word quisling. The word quisling is a synonym for traitor. It means traitor, and it was coined after World War II, named after this person on the left, whose name was Quisling, and he was a traitor, a Nazi collaborator in Norway. And of course, the character Scrooge from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Scrooge, to be a Scrooge, that became a word. And Google, of course, to Google, it's become a verb. So that's a new word. That's a neologism. A truism is a self-evident statement and can be a proverb. What goes around comes around. The door swings both ways. A broken watch is right 2 times a day. Sounds like proverbs. These are called truisms because they are technically self-evident. They make sense. They are absolutely true in a sense. A tautology is using more words with the same meaning together, like DVD disc. Doesn't really make much sense because the last D in DVD stands for disc. The same with the V in HIV stands for virus. But something like saying a sad misfortune, that's a tautology because obviously a misfortune is never a good thing. So a sad misfortune, sort of using two words together that have the same meaning. Yeah. Sorry. And anthropomorphism, that is ascribing human characteristics to something non-human. For instance, the character Brian from Family Guy is a dog but acts like a human. So that's anthropomorphism. Anthro is the Greek for human, and morph, of course, to change. So anthropomorphism, change into human. A euphemism, I earlier said something about innuendo. So euphemism, closely related to that, that's using an innocent word as a replacement for a more sensitive word. Often sexual, but it can be something others as well. It's like using something, a euphemistic word for death, or instead of saying he died, he passed away, for instance. That's like a euphemism. You don't want to use the word die or death. Oxymoron, that's using two contradictory words together, two words that cannot be together because they contradict each other. That's an oxymoron. Can be used for comedic effect as well, claiming that something is an oxymoron when it really doesn't have to be. A rhetorical question, that's making a point by asking a question not intended to be answered, of course, because it leads the audience into agreeing with you. And let's go through some idioms. Of course, there are many idioms in English. There are at least 25,000 from what I've read. Idiomatic expressions in English that you can use in a sentence. And the whole point of idioms, of course, it gives the language some flavor, and people who know them can use them and communicate and know what other people mean when they use them and understand each other. For instance, this idiom, it cost an arm and a leg. That's not literal. It's an idiom, and it just means it was expensive. Or the idiom, not out of the woods yet. We're not out of the woods yet. That means there's some challenge ahead, or we are currently confronted with a challenge, and it's not over yet. Or barking up the wrong tree, or raining cats and dogs, or between a rock and a hard place, meaning you have to choose between two difficult choices. Through thick and thin, a far cry from many nice idioms. To see eye to eye, that means to agree, to have the guts, to be courageous, to have courage, have in mind, a change of heart. Beats me, that's also an idiom. It means you don't know, beats me. Kick the bucket, that's a euphemism, really, an idiom for dying, to kick the bucket, to die. Head over heels, to go by the book is an idiom. Have a screw loose, to be crazy, have a screw loose, that's an idiom. A dead ringer, that means to be identical as, or to be very similar to, as in you look like someone else, you're a dead ringer for that person. Add insult to injury. And a good one, catch-22. It's also a neologism because it's named after a book called Catch-22. It's closely related to being between a rock and a hard place, but it's even worse. It's like you don't really have two choices, but you can't do one. You can't do the one decision you want to make because it contradicts itself or something. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and catch my other videos if you haven't already.